Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm sitting on your right side.
Yes, you always are on my right side.
Uh, Let me just talk about the moot point. The moot point is that we are no longer using the word boom. We are not using the word doom, but we've certainly started using the word gloom. The world is slowing down. We've started shaking a lot. Higher frequency data points is indicating that the slowdown is biting the consumer. And officially, Indians have stopped using the word achhe din.
Well, I'm glad you did not use the so-called R word. And I want to quickly get that out of the way. And it is important that one should get it out of the way because one should not bandy around words loosely. The word recession is used, it's a technical word, it's used when the GDP declines for at least 2 quarters. Last full year for which we have figures, 6.8. This year, broadly the projections for real growth rate, not only within the government but also from outside the government, the range between 6.5 and 7. The worst I've seen is 6.2. So certainly not, let's not use the word recession. Yes, there is a downturn, and this downturn has been going on for a fairly long time. It's not something that's happened in 2014. If you track quarter by quarter, it's been declining for quite some time. So the question to ask is not so much sentiments, because sentiments are transitory, but if we are looking towards 5 trillion in 2024-25, we need to think a little bit beyond what sentiments today are and what the Sensex is today, and ask ourselves what we need to do to jack up that growth rate to a higher growth rate.
You understand numbers, sir, more than anyone else. You're an economist, and you're a purist, and you're a practitioner. If you look at the number of 5 trillion, logically looking at the current framework of global backdrop, local growth, savings, and also a combination of where the investment cycle is, if I can top up where earnings are, it looks impossible. It looks like an impossible task that India will be a $5 trillion economy by 2024 or 25.
All right, so now let's distill it down. Firstly, it's a $5 trillion figure, which means it's a function of whatever is the exchange rate. If the exchange rate depreciates, it becomes a little bit tough. If the exchange rate appreciates, exchange rate meaning rupee dollar, if the rupee appreciates, it becomes a little bit easier. So there is an exchange rate angle to it. Also, there is an inflation angle to it. And the inflation angle, let's accept, is let's say around 4% because that's what the RBI's target is. If you take all of that away, depending on your assumptions about what is going to happen to the exchange rate, you have a real GDP growth rate figure. And what is that real GDP growth rate figure? Well, one exercise was done in last economic survey, which says a figure of 8.5%. Whether it's 8.5% or 8% or 9%, depends on your assumptions. You can sit down with your mobile and work out your own assumptions. But the fact remains, yes, we need to jack up the growth rate from 6.5 or 7% to that 8.5. There are 4 ways of slicing this. They are not alternative ways, they are simply 4 different ways of slicing this. The first way of slicing this is what any macroeconomist would do, which is, let's look at the 4 important components, 4 components that drive growth: consumption, government expenditure, investments, and exports, meaning net exports. And you're absolutely right that the external world environment does not look very kind. It is not as benign as it used to be when we clocked 9% real GDP growth rates for a period of time. It's not going to ease off. So the sources of growth have to come endogenously. This is one way of slicing it. The second way of slicing it is the way any microeconomist would look at it. And he or she would say, there are essentially 3 factor inputs. There is labor, there is land, there is capital, and the rest of it is productivity. And many of the government's initiatives in the area of transport in this kind of lens will show up as productivity increases. So how do we make land markets more efficient? Capital markets more efficient, labor markets more efficient. The third way of slicing it is the sectoral one. What do we do about agriculture, primary products? What do we do about industry, the secondary sector? And what do we do about services? And the fourth way of slicing it, which is perhaps even more pertinent here, is to look at the states, because after all, that all India growth rate of 8 and 8.5% does not happen in Delhi, it happens at the level of the states. And depending on the year, if you take away railways and defense, 90 to 95% of India's GDP accrues in the states. So what do you need to do to jack up growth rates in different states, including southern parts of India?
Okay. The four components, which are very crucial components: land, labor, cost of capital, affordability. Some would argue that the intent is there, but the intent has not really translated into something which could be called as on-ground reality. I'll start with land. Look at the laws. We start with productivity levels. They've improved, but they've not really gone, and they've not kept in pace with global standards. Our labor laws clearly not best in the world or best in Asia. These are politically sensitive topics.
Yes, they are politically sensitive topics, but I think one of the things to realize is when one is talking to the union government, when one is talking to someone like Piyush Goyal, when one is talking to someone like the Prime Minister, that's the executive arm of union government. Thankfully, in our country, as defined by the Constitution, there are two other organs of state, which are Parliament, all state legislatures, and the judiciary. In a democracy, whatever we try to do needs to be done bearing in mind that these two other organs also exist. We should also remember the federal nature of the Constitution. And in the Constitution, there is a 7th schedule where land is squarely in the state list. I'm constantly surprised that many people don't know that land is not even in the concurrent list, it is in the state list, which takes one to labor. Labor laws are not as simple as just the hire and fire, which is a reference to Chapter 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act. Depending on how you define a piece of labor legislation, there are between 50 to 54 different labor laws. Of late, the union government has codified all of them under 4 codes. I am not suggesting for a minute that this is perfect. But let us at least recognize that the initiative has started, because the first time I heard of labor reforms in India was in a document that was brought out by the Ministry of Finance, Department of Economic Affairs in the year 1992, 1993. You can go and look it up. At least compared to that, we have moved forward.
Okay. I'll talk about something which in a sense has been a big puzzle and it remains a mystery. Why are companies like Air India or BSNL still being subsidized? They are far behind in terms of technology adoption. They have fat losses and taxpayer money is always reimbursing them.
Well, I think it was yesterday or day before yesterday, the minister has said very unambiguously and in clear terms that Air India is going to be privatized. Air India is, of course, a very visible aspect. But let us recognize the following. There are more than 230 central public sector enterprises. The broader agenda is not just Air India, the 230 public sector enterprises, and public sector enterprises are, by the way, not only at the union government level, they're also at the state government level. I'm focusing on the union government level ones. The most valuable asset that many of them have, and the most controversial asset that many of them have, is land. And what often people do not realize is that even if it is a central PAC, the land actually does not belong to the PAC, the land belongs to the state government and is with the union, with the central PAC on lease, often for a specific purpose. Some of that land has been encroached on. Some of that land is subject to litigation. So I'm not talking about 10 PSEs, if I'm talking about all central PSEs across the board, the first thing you would need is an inventory of that land. And that's one of the reasons why complete privatization takes time. Finally, we now have an inventory of that land. So, not just Air India, as I said, is the most visible one, but I'm fairly optimistic that we will soon begin to have some genuine privatization.
How many? What's the number? Niti Aayog has come out with a number. What's your realistic sense here?
No. Again, I would not like to be binary about it because there is a process. There is a process that one has to go through. There is a question of bidders. Depending on the sector, depending on the enterprise, you may or may not have sufficient bidders. So it's very difficult to put a timeline to how soon and how fast. One could have an artificial figure, which one does for budgetary purposes, but that's for budgetary purposes. Otherwise, it is difficult to put a timeline.
Just for the benefit of the audience here, the finance minister today, she's made an announcement that there would be mega merger within the PSU banks now. Everyone's been making a case that with the exception of 3 or 4 large PSU banks, other PSU banks, they should be folding up. But easier said than done. There are unions, there are NPAs, there are mixed issues. How do you think this entire NPA problem for banks will get sorted, and do you think merging of PSU banks, and especially weak banks, is the only answer?
Well, one thing you have not mentioned, and that is the legislation. Because there is a legislation that also has to be changed, repealed, amended before you actually sell off the public sector banks. The public sector banks are also very heterogeneous. So I am not very sure you can tar all of them with one brush and say, hey, look, let us sell off all the public sector banks. So I suspect what is likely to happen, and that's both a pragmatic and a rational way of looking at it, is that you will have a different answer for different public sector banks. And the rationale for some of the merger is that you might get better value when you actually begin to sell them off.
Fair point. Let's throw in the hard fact, and the hard fact is that no economy in the world post-World War has managed to grow if the company has not spent on consumption and if exports are not strong. The world around us is changing, which is that trade war is a reality, productivity levels have changed. Is India really prepared for this new normal, both in terms of where the consumption cycle is moving and also where exactly the export stroke the trade war is going to take the world?
I already said that the external world, the external environment does not look very bright. Exports depend on 3 things. They depend on demand factors, that does not look very bright. They depend on the exchange rate, particularly exports of goods. They depend on the exchange rate, and exchange rate depends on a whole variety of factors. And the supply side, and some of the things that the government has been doing is in the nature of improving logistics, improving customs, but the fact remains that the demand side is going to remain weak. So the sources of growth have to be internal. As I said earlier, the consumption, investment, and government expenditure. Public expenditure, because of fiscal consolidation requirements, is perforce constrained. The government has already sort of announced that there will be some rationalization of that public expenditure, so the efficiency of public expenditure will become better. Do remember the context of the 15th Finance Commission, which is soon going to submit its recommendations, and remember that coterminous with the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission, the present package of centrally sponsored schemes will also be changed. Also to remember the perspective, other than GST, which you have heard about, a task force on direct taxes already submitted its recommendations, so there will be some rationalization on the tax side also. But to come back to stop the digression, government expenditure perforce is going to be constrained. So it boils down to consumption and investments. And investments, yes, in certain sectors there is excess capacity, there is the hangover of the NPAs, which in my view, a complete cleaning up will at least take 2 or 3 years. But the simple point I want to make is that I think in 2 quarters, you will not use the word, did you use the word doom? Probably you did not. But if you use the word doom, in 2 quarters you will not use the word doom. You might still use the word gloom. Now what I mean by that is that it's
Well,
not
I
going
use
to-
the word achhe then.
It's what I mean by that, don't get me wrong, it's not going to get spectacularly better after 2 quarters, but after 2 quarters, I think we will begin to see that from today's model projection of 6.5, we are going to talk about 7. We're going to talk about 7.5. We are not yet going to talk about 9% plus. That in my case, in my view, is not possible given the external environment. But we have enough slack internally. We have talked about the southern states in passing earlier. All southern states have not grown fast enough. There is a state which is pulling down the south as a whole. And remember, by the way, the south is coastal, also means exports. There are the eastern states which have simply not grown fast enough. Now, if some of those eastern states begin to jack up their growth rates, then that all India of growth rate of 8% to my mind is doable, not that 9%.
I'll draw your attention to what needs to be done to improve the sentiment. Sentiment is something which is completely broken down. We've heard from the finance minister last week. We heard from the finance minister today. We know that steps have been taken on FDI. But the problem is that the high frequency data, which is for autos, FMCG, all of them have reversed. What do you think needs to be done to address the sentiment and revival immediately?
The auto sector, by the way, is in not great shape anywhere in the world. That's because of changes in technology, changes in consumer preferences. I realize there are people from industry here. Whenever people from industry generally want sentiments to be reversed, what they really mean is fiscal concessions for my sector. Because other than that, you do not reverse sentiments for a particular sector. And of course, therefore, you pick up certain sectors, biscuits, but you will not pick up smartphones. As an economist, my argument would be that what we need to do to revive sentiments is to have across-the-board reforms. And in this particular case, from the union government's point of view, the single most important reform that will reverse sentiments, in my view, is the cleaning up of direct taxes and the cleaning up of indirect taxes, which of course will have to happen through the GST Council. But the direct taxes is union government's purview. So in terms of reversing sentiments, I think that is the single most important bit, other than, of course, privatization and so on and so forth.
So put it very simply, I don't want to get this one wrong. Are you hinting that in this budget, tax kam ho jayega?
I think people should read budget speeches carefully, and if you read budget speeches carefully, and had you read budget speeches carefully, you would have noticed that the question of tax exemptions and tax rate reductions were mentioned in a budget speech, and both were in the same sentence, not just in the same paragraph, in the same sentence. In other words, you want lower tax rates, give up exemptions. Give up the idea of reversing sentiments for specific sectors.
Globally, if I look at what the Trump regime or the Republican regime is following, what is happening in Europe, taxes are coming down. Is it a good idea to tax rich more or super rich more in India?
This is a moot point. This is a moot point because we expect several things that the government should do. Our demands are endless on the part of the government. 6% of GDP should be spent on education. 4% should be spent on health. 6 plus 4, 10. 10% should be spent on infrastructure. 10 plus 10, 20. 3% should be spent on defense. 20 plus 3, 23%. What is the total tax GDP ratio, union plus state governments together? 16%. The reason it is important to remember this is many of these other countries where tax rates have come down, as they've come down in the last couple of decades, before that the tax rates used to be higher, are countries where these public goods and services have already been delivered. And therefore the demands on the part of the government doing things is less. If we want lower tax rates, we will have to reduce the expectations on the part of the government, which is unlikely to happen, because we cannot expect railway stations like X country, airports like Y country, and simultaneously say we will not pay taxes. There are ways to still fund it, but the cost will be borne by the succeeding generations, which I'm sure we don't want to do. So, tax rates coming down, I think, is a function of removal of exemptions. And just on that note, there is a revenue foregone statement that comes in the budget. And that tells you that 5 to 5.5% is revenue foregone. Had that revenue not been foregone, the tax GDP ratio would have been 16 plus 5.5, 21 to 22%.
If I may just share a feedback which I've got, and again, this is feedback from corporates, so we got to take it with a pinch of salt. They said, okay, you're taxing rich more, okay, but those rich who are essentially responsible for taking the entrepreneurial risk, they are responsible for, they may represent 1% here, less than 1%, but they are the rate change agent. Is it a good idea to tax them when in India interest rates and cost of borrowing already is very high?
You know, there's a serious element to that, and there is a, what I think is a frivolous angle to that. If you, not you, if someone is saying interest rates in India are too high by global standards, on the flip side, wage costs in India are also lower than global standards. That's the normal law of economics and factor endowment. So that's a non-serious argument. The serious argument is, one is questioning progressivity of taxation. Now, progressivity of direct taxation is accepted everywhere in the world. The rich need to be taxed more so that the poor can be cross-subsidized, and this is best done through direct taxes, not through indirect taxes. But so far as simplification is concerned, that's a genuine argument, and as I said, that I think will follow consequent to the recommendations of the task force on direct taxes.
You know, as journalists, we always hunt for the word khabar. So what would be your promise? What would be assurance? What would be your indication as to next 6-12 months? What would be the big change from the administration, from the various departments? What is the big idea which in a sense will galvanize things?
I think I will go back and I will watch the FM's press conference, which I missed because of this. That would have the big cover.
One thing you love about this job before we wrap, because we are almost exceeding the time, and one thing you hate about this job.
What I love about this job is that you are offering inputs to the Prime Minister, and one should always recognize that when you offer inputs, you should not have the expectation that everything you say will be accepted. That does not happen. What I hate about this job, I'm not going to use the word hate, but you used it, so I'm going to not contest it, is people constantly tell me that what are you doing? What is your advice? Why don't you place it in the public domain? And my constant response is, I'm not an economic advisory council to the country. I'm the economic advisory council to the Prime Minister. So my counsel is for the Prime Minister and not to be revealed through television. And I don't mean just this.
So you're actually telling me not to ask my next question, so I'll rephrase it. Which is one advice you've been constantly giving to the Prime Minister's office, and you're feeling slightly frustrated. You know, as an economist, that's the right advice, but somehow that advice is getting lost.
No, I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. You see, whenever, in all seriousness, I'm saying this, that reforms are never costless. Anyone who says reforms are costless doesn't know what he or she is talking about. Reforms are never win-win for everyone. Someone or the other gets hurt. So there is a question of managing stakeholders, and your job as Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister means not just being an academic economist and submitting those recommendations, but also managing those expectations and countering the arguments. So the way I would look at it is, if I have not been able to sell an idea, that's because I have not been able to think of convincing enough counter-arguments against the arguments that have been advanced.
Okay. We started with the word Achhe Din. 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. Next time when we meet at the next forum, you think I can officially introduce you as, I can officially start using the word Achhedan?
My Hindi is not very good, but I'm certain the next time it will be not just Achhe Din, but also Achhi Raat.
Yeah, that's a very solid note to close this chat on. So I'll give it back to my colleagues Sumit and Pajmaj. But thank you very much. You've been very vocal, you've been very insightful, and thank you for all your lovely, wonderful insights. Thank you very much.